This is lecture 10 on Callbacks and Allusions, the legacy of trauma and colonial power in Gyasi's Homegoing. For this day 4, we will have 2 lectures on the connection between colonialism on the one hand and trauma on the other hand. And then for our 3rd lecture of the day, we're going to shift topics yet again and talk about COVID-19 representation. This lecture will take up the special novel Homegoing by Gyasi. She was a Stanford University student who was inspired by a visit to Cape Coast Castle and learned a history she was previously unaware of. We are going to do something different for assessment today, since I am talking at length about a novel that I feel is very important, but was not on your reading list because I could not ask you to read a 300-page novel in addition to everything else. So we felt like we should provide we provided scans and essays of short stories, but not the novel. What you have in your packet instead is an interview between Gyasi and Stanford Alumni Magazine about her experiences. And so for our tutorial, what we're going to do is have you look at that interview and think about what she says in there alongside this lecture today to just give you a little bit more background on the novel in case you want to study it further. After your assessment, we will take up the post-colonial theoretical writings of Leela Gandhi, who uses the language of trauma theory to define a post-colonial approach. And then we will begin our final unit on trauma and the pandemic this afternoon. So please come back for those lectures, even though you will have done your assessment this morning. One of the ways I approach Gyasi as a post-colonial trauma text is through the idea of the empire writing back. This is a title of a book by Bill Ashcroft, Gareth Griffiths, and Helen Triffin, and was the first major theoretical account looking at wide-ranging post-colonial texts and their relation to the larger issues of post-colonial culture. The book opens up debates about the interrelationships of post-colonial literatures, investigates the powerful forces acting on language in post-colonial texts, and shows how these texts constitute a radical critique of Eurocentric notions of literature and language. The motif of today is going to be that literature is culture, that the way that colonial power worked was not necessarily through the might of a navy, but through the might of the written word, the messaging, the printing presses. And so my idea is that literature can fight back with literature, right, with the literary word. So Gyasi's novel, 2016, appeared after Empire Writes Back, which is dated 2002, but I think she is doing something similar with all of her references to the literary legacy of African and African American writers. And she's arguing through references to this history that literature of the diaspora might always have the last word. I'm extremely interested in Gyasi as an up-and-coming writer because she so effectively uses allusion to the history of writing in the African diaspora to showcase a different point of view or reality. She writes about writing. She writes about colonialism, she writes about trauma, she writes about the power of writing itself. And in these allusions, she shows the strength of a literary tradition free from and born out of colonial rule. Gyasi's Homegoing begins in the 18th century near Cape Coast Castle and shows through 2 intertwined family stories the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on contemporary Black American lives. The novel is about the past, in other words, but it is also about the present. The novel echoes, using a fictional universe, what Ta-Nehisi Coates and James Baldwin have suggested in their nonfiction. that unless we confront the crimes against black bodies that took place in the 18th century, both in colonized Africa and in the US where they were enslaved, then we will not be able to address the crimes against black bodies that are with us today. The novel, in other words, is very much about history. It is about the effects of captivity and return of African Americans to Ghana and other parts of Africa. However, it is also a novel about literature itself, a novel grounded both in African folklore as well as some of the greatest writing of the 20th century. It is a novel indebted to James Baldwin's fiction about drugs and gentrification, particularly his story Sonny's Blues from 1957, but also Previous Condition from 1948, and his novel If Beale Street Could Talk from 1974. So for this presentation, I will be shifting from one side of the ocean to the other side of the ocean, starting with characters who find themselves living in Cape Coast Castle, two sisters, one who lives upstairs with a European colonist and is quite protected, and the other sister who is shackled in chains in the dungeon bound for slavery in the US. Two sisters, one castle. They occupy two radically different places on the hierarchy. And their fates are forever altered due to this one significant distinction. I think in her Africa sections, Gyasi is invoking the work not only of Joseph Conrad, whose Heart of Darkness represents Africans as quote-unquote savages from the point of view of other colonizers, but she is also invoking Chinua Achebe, who wrote against the empire's judgment of Africans this way in his novel, Things Fall Apart. So what I'm trying to say is Gyasi takes all of these writers, Joseph Conrad, Chinua Achebe, James Baldwin, so many others, but those are the three we'll focus on today, and puts their voices in her novel as a way to write back against colonial forces and attitudes. For Gyasi, it is not enough to have a paired text of Heart of Darkness and Things Fall Apart. Things Fall Apart was the answer to Heart of Darkness. She adds another voice, another layer. She adds her voice via callbacks and allusions to the tradition that came before her. This is her way of writing back to, of standing up to the legacy of colonial rule, inserting her own voice in a literary tradition, in a book not only about the colonial slave trade, but also the very tradition of literature itself. She gets to write the story. She is a storyteller among storytellers. So if we go all the way back to Heart of Darkness, 1899, Joseph Conrad, this is often taught in English departments as an exemplary literary text. Look how well this is written, professors say. And Chinua Achebe will come back later and say, it might be very well written, but it is very dangerous in the way it represents Africans. And let's think about that fact from a culture perspective. So we have Heart of Darkness, we have Chinua Achebe's answer to Heart of Darkness, and then we have Gyasi's answer to Achebe, which I think is really interesting. So we'll look at that first, and then we'll go over to the American context and look at Gyasi's representation of Baldwin and his representation of white supremacy in the US. So Joseph Conrad's Marlowe, we learn from very early, is the teller of tales. That is his power. He writes the story. And you wonder to what extent he can be truly trusted from very early on. Achebe plays with storytelling another way, through shifts in perspective and direct references to stories themselves. In part 2, chapter 15, Tribesman Obierka says, quote, "We have heard stories about white men who made the powerful guns and the strong drinks and took slaves away across the seas, but no one thought the stories were true. And when his friend replies, "There is no story that is not true," he seems to be speaking for the entire global tradition of literature, its interest in how and why stories are told. And I feel like that's why those of us who studied literature and language are so compelled by this post-colonial project. We understand that language is so powerful, and these authors do too. In an Image of Africa, novelist Achebe argues, on the one hand, that Conrad is, quote, one of the great stylists of modern fiction and a good storyteller into the bargain. Heart of Darkness, he tells us, is considered by top critics as one of, quote, the greatest short novels in the English language. That said, the novel also, argues Achebe, quote, projects the image of Africa as the other world, the antithesis of Europe and therefore of civilization, a place where man's vaunted intelligence and refinement are finally mocked by triumphant bestiality. That's the first quote. I realized in my lecture notes I didn't bold where I need to show you the slides. So this one refers to Achebe's sense that stories are important. His novel, Things Fall Apart, is a novel about novels. And here is Achebe's critique, a post-colonial critique of Heart of Darkness, one of the most important novellas. It's dangerous, he says, because it projects the image of Africa as other, the other world, the antithesis of Europe, and therefore the antithesis of civilization. We see whose perspective seems to win out at the end of Things Fall Apart. When tribal leader Okonkwo hangs himself, due to strains, vulnerabilities, and humiliations foundational to the human form. When the commissioner, this is haunting, the commissioner, who is the chief colonial, exemplary colonial force, he gets the last word in Achebe's novel, and he says he's going to write his own book. He says, take down the body. He realizes he is too powerful for it to be him. And then he says he plans to write a book about his adventures and thinks very highly of himself as someone who, quote, brings civilization to different parts of Africa. He wants to set down his version of history. But as we will soon see, we are in dangerous territory when the commissioner, the person with power, begins to tell the story of an entire race of people he does not understand. In the book which he planned to write, this is from the end of Things Fall Apart, he would stress that point. As he walked back to the court, he thought about that book he would write. Every day brought him new material. The story of this man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make interesting reading. Interesting reading, we can think about that. One could almost write a whole chapter on him. Perhaps not a whole chapter, but a reasonable paragraph, at any rate. There was so much else to include, and one must be firm in cutting out details. He had already chosen the title of the book after much thought, The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of Lower Niger. We are not meant to trust this voice, right? He gets to say what stories matter. He gets to determine the perspective. And his perspective is on, quote, primitive tribes and pacification. In the many years in which he has toiled to bring civilization to different parts of Africa, this commissioner had lamented a number of things. One of them was that as district commissioner, he must never attend to such undignified details as cutting a hanged man from the tree. and such attention would give the natives a poor opinion of him. In the book he planned to write, he says he would stress that point. And then this is the description of the book he wanted to write. Gyasi's Homegoing takes back the power of the story. She writes back to this final moment that has the commissioner deciding what the history of Africa is. Homegoing takes back the power and allows the writing of another account. Through allusions to many writers, such as Achebe himself, his voice, this voice, is all over Gyasi's novel. In so doing, it dramatizes the effects of British colonial rule and the U.S. slave trade on generations of families of African descent. Beginning in a coastal village in Ghana in 1764 and extending into the present day, the novel's unusual narrative structure represents points of view of distinct family members on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. So I want us to kind of think about the form of the contemporary novel. You know, we kind of talk about how novels written after 1950 are alienating in their structure. They have multiple points of view. They are told out of order. That didn't happen just by accident, right? It's not like authors woke up one day and thought, let's all write differently now than the modernist novel or the Victorian novel. One of the things we could argue about the style of the contemporary novel that takes a post-colonialism is in its style, it is also writing back to colonial values, the colonial novel. So that is the way Gyasi's novel is structured also, alternating points of view, references to different parts of history. Drawing on such motifs as fire, water, Christianity, and insanity, which we'll talk about for our next pairing, Gyasi's novel connects these family members through generations, even when they do not know the entire story of their ancestors. In this way, Gyasi links the stories of Abina and Akua, mother and daughter, telling most poignantly the story of Akua, who unwittingly reenacts her own mother's trauma and simultaneously reveals the unspeakable effects of intergenerational trauma. There's that word, unwitting. We talked about that in the very first day, right? So reading Akua's story, we can see how Gyasi's novel overall worries about the ways of the legacy, not only of the project of the Christian missionaries in Africa, but also about the U.S. slave trade and how that affects the U.S. in the present day. In tracing Gyasi's representation of the traumatic legacy of the slave trade and the missionary project, I want to juxtapose a close reading of two powerful scenes. Both of them are in the Akua chapter of the novel, and this is set in Ghana. The first is on page 189, when the missionary testifies to drowning Abina and then burning her body. And the second is a few pages later, a dream sequence in which Akua unknowingly killed two daughters while she dreamed and is taken away before her son Ya dies too. Both scenes mix fire and water imagery, and they not only connect the mother with the story of her daughter, but also inverts the way we think about fire and water generally. At the end of the Akua scene, we no longer know if water represents purity and fire represents passion. In Gyasi's book, fire and water can both save lives, but fire and water can take lives too. In these African sections in Homegoing, water is used as a baptismal kind of reference, right? But then the question is, to what use is the baptism put in a colonial text? So the first time we see water as having the potential to do harm in the sequence is when a missionary tells Akua that he wants her to, quote, repent for her sin, which in Abina's mind was not a sin, conceiving her daughter, the very daughter to whom the missionary is telling his story. The missionary tells her about taking Abina to water to, quote, be baptized. But the moment is described with such violence that appears more as a drowning scene than as one of repentance. Such words as forced, carried her, and thrashed, repeated 5 times, spoken by the missionary, again, he gets to tell this story, reveal that Abina resisted his efforts, and that resulted in her drowning. The moment is so horrific in his story, as his story trails off, he never actually communicates that the baptismal moment results in death. I only wanted her to repent, says the missionary, and as we see, that leads to death. After the missionary's speech cuts off and gives way to a, quote, terrible, heaving, guttural sound, Akua realizes what he is telling her. When she says, where is her body, she is asking him what he did with the evidence of his murder. It is at this moment where water imagery turns to fire imagery. He had burned her body with all of her things in the forest, leaving nothing of Abina, not even her belongings, as traces that she once existed. Despite his pleas for forgiveness here, the missionary, we understand Akua's frustration as she steps over his body that has fallen to the ground. It seems a very rare moment of agency when Akua walked over his body to leave. She steps over the missionary who has now fallen over. But the fire imagery and the water imagery return in Akua's story not 10 pages later, where we learn that Akua has fallen asleep, dreaming she was on the same beach with the missionaries from this school. And we've talked about traumatic dreams as evidence of PTSD, right? Reliving these horrific accounts, these stories passed on. I don't have a passage for this. In the first part of the dream sequence, she dreams of water. In the second, she dreams that the water becomes a fire woman whose, quote, arms were the 2 fire children, a surreal dreamlike presentation that results in the burning of Akua's children in waking life. As it happens, Akua wakes to find she is the fire woman. She has burned her hands and feet. It's hard for me to illustrate this without assigning the whole text, but the idea is that this unwitting burning is passed on from mother to daughter to granddaughter based on the traumatic legacy of colonial power. So in this instance, the daughter is dreaming of fire and ends up accidentally burning her 2 children. And this is the daughter of a woman who was drowned at the hands of a missionary. So like the repeated dreaming of fire and water ends up being enacted in real life. And so it's easy for an outsider to say this woman just burned 2 children with her hands. The other explanation is far more compelling and compassionate, which is she is having traumatic nightmares based on the legacy of colonialism and unwittingly burned her 2 children. That's the Clorinda story, right? That's the dream of the burning child story. So as a result of this horrific crime, villagers call Akua the crazy woman. But I think that we readers are much more generous to this mourning mother who has not only lost her mother, but her 2 daughters as well. We might say that Akua is not crazy, but rather suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, carrying the weight of her mother's drowning and burning with her in her dreams. Such a realization not only brings empathy to Akua the character, but to women generally who suffer in their dreams, as well as generations of women like her who have learned the horrific histories of their ancestors in the wake of Westerners' quote-unquote civilizing projects through the slave trade and the Christian mission. In the end of this section, we see more evidence of traumatic repetition through the burning of Akua's body as punishment for acting out her own worst nightmare. So now we have the deaths of 3 generations. We are left only to hope that her surviving son, Ya, is able to break the cycle. What is remarkable about Gyasi's novel is that she shows through alternating chapters how the effects of colonization are also felt in the United States through the enslavement of African bodies over 200 years. So this is not an easy novel. We have effects of colonial power in Africa chapters, and then effects of the slave trade in the U.S. chapters, and they're interwoven, as if to say these are interrelated issues. Gyasi represents the effects of colonial power as it takes place on both sides of the world, Ghana on the one hand and the United States on the other hand. I would like to read a chapter set now in Harlem of the U.S. as a perfect example of how Gyasi shows the traumatic legacy through generations, but also how she once again draws on callbacks and allusions to show the power of a literary tradition, going back to the powerful African writer we see in Achebe, as in the Firewoman chapters, but also the powerful Black American author James Baldwin, whose voice is all over the text in the later part. It seems like a reparative gesture to me, calling on her forefathers, seeking a choir of voices to write back to the colonizing voice of the commander in Africa who was there to quote unquote civilize the Africans and then write his book about it. So now we'll shift gears a little bit to talk about James Baldwin. We see this influence of James Baldwin, but also a clear cultural anxiety about dispossession in Gyasi's section called Sunny, which, like Baldwin's story, takes place in New York in the middle of the last century. James Baldwin's story is set in Harlem and features the story of two brothers, Sonny and the unnamed narrator who tries to make sense of Sonny, a drug user and jazz musician. So I think it's really interesting. Like, to read the Sonny chapter in Gyasi's novel is to go back and reread, in the 21st century context, James Baldwin's story, Sonny, which was written in the 1950s. Baldwin's narrator in this 1950s story, lost my place, has chosen the straight path of becoming a teacher. He is raising his family in Harlem, where he and Sonny grew up. Sonny has just been released from prison at the beginning of this story, and now is looking for meaning in music. But he is also a drug user. Baldwin's Sonny talks to his brother about the struggle to be able to tolerate it all. And when he says he is just trying to stand it, you aren't quite sure if he is talking about the struggle to hold it together in the face of the music inside him, or the realities of the projects outside, to stand up to the realities of the housing projects. This story, Baldwin's story, ends in a jazz club, with Sonny playing in a circle of light, and his brother is looking on, finally connecting with his brother rather than judging him. Baldwin's story is mirrored in significant moments of Gyasi's chapter, but placed as it is in the context of all the other stories, the stories going back to Africa. The story of Willie and her marriage to Robert, for example, and Willie's father, H. Black, all of these generations, even looking forward to Sonny's son Marcus at the end of the novel. Gyasi's novel goes beyond the small window of a Baldwin story to show how one person's history is tied to another, all the way back down through generations, right? And all the way moving forward. Homegoing illustrates the effects of slavery on the African diaspora, but also on families and each generation's response to this inherited legacy that translates as housing trauma by the 21st century and drug addiction as well. The first paragraph of Gyasi's Sonny section, like Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, refers to Sonny's time in jail, and we are left to ask, why is Sonny in jail? Has he made some bad decisions? That might be, again, a very easy answer, but what Gyasi says is this has been incoming for 200 years of trying to deal with the legacy of colonialism. And in this chapter, Gyasi goes back and refers to another foundational text in African American history, W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. I feel like Gyasi is like, okay, like forefathers, help me tell this story. Chinua Achebe, James Baldwin, W.E.B. Du Bois. Sunny has read this book, and we know, of course, that Gyasi has read it too. It is one of the many references to literary works in her novel that the tradition is built upon. Gyasi, in other words, sees her novel as participating in the literary legacies of these writers, Du Bois, Baldwin. The Souls of Black Folk is important in this section because it articulates, nearly foretells that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That's Du Bois's line. The first line in the Sunny section is, quote, and this is the passage you have next. Jail gave Sunny time to read. He used the hours before his mother bailed him out to thumb through the Souls of Black Folk. He'd read it 4 times already and still wasn't tired of it. It reaffirmed for him the purpose of his being there, on an iron bench, in an iron cell. Gyasi's Sunny is different than Baldwin's in the sense that he has been arrested repeatedly, we learn later, for attending protests, for his activism, and not for possession of drugs. But the possession of drugs is what links the story of Sunny to the story of his father told in a prior section. Although the Sunny section is set distinctly in the past of the radical 60s, its prose seems to reflect the continued reality even Gyasi could not know. Sunny thinks, how many times could he pick himself up off the dirty floor of a jail cell? How many hours he could spend marching, how many bruises could he collect from the police, how many letters to the mayor, governor, president could he send, how many more days would it take to get something to change, and when it changed, would it change? Would America be any different, or would it mostly be the same? That's anaphora, right? That repetition. How many days, how many years, how long will it take? Gyasi Sunny is an activist, not unlike the activists that are taking the streets at the very moment as we speak. What Gyasi's writing showcases is not that she has the power to predict the future, but she is writing out of a past literary tradition, from Du Bois to Garvey to Baldwin to Coates, that has detailed the conditions of segregation, police brutality, and protest without change, and that we have witnessed this all before. Sunny, we learn, is on the housing team of the NAACP, which allows Gyasi to refer even farther back to Baldwin's 1948 story, Previous Condition, about a young black actor looking for housing in New York. If this literary chapter is about literature, it is also about housing and gentrification, which we talked about yesterday, about political and a legal push for change. When Sunny, our Sunny, Gyasi's Sunny, asks tenants in Harlem about their housing situation, he repeatedly hears the same story. In fact, Sunny could not have gone to a single apartment, and he still would have known what the tenants would say. He and Willie, his mother, and his sister Josephine had lived in conditions like these, much worse. The key word here, the wink to readers of literature, is condition. In a chapter about housing in Harlem, drugs, and gentrification, with a chapter named after James Baldwin's character, Gyasi here reveals what Baldwin refers to as the previous condition, one with origins all the way back to the slave trade. And it requires our attention in 2016 when this is published, in 2021 when I was working out this reading, in 2025 when we are coming out of a pandemic and so much unrest, requiring people to feel like they need to stay in their homes, knowing that some among us do not have homes and are living in conditions with, quote, so many roaches and rats, we gotta keep the toothbrushes in the fridge, as one mother tells Sunny. It is the mothers and young sons who seem to touch Sunny the most. It's the children, right? As he too recalls being a young, vulnerable boy in the care of his mother, Willie. When reflecting on a prior memory with his own mother, a young boy in the projects interrupts his thoughts, asking, "Can you help me, mister?" It is not the question that pulls Sunny under so much as the boy's answer to his own question, with the repetition and the refrain 5 times ringing in Sunny's head that he read for that week, a month, a year. "You can't do a single thing, can you?" This is the witness, the voice of the child, calling on Sunny, "Can you help me?" And he repeats to himself over and over as he continues throughout the day, "You can't do a single thing." When Sunny asks the man who sweeps the barber shops on 7th Avenue, "What do you do when you feel helpless?" An echo from the Baldwin story, "How do you stand it?" The man gives him drugs and says when smoking doesn't help, the drugs will. But Sunny, Jesse's Sunny, doesn't choose just yet, although we are always worried that he is on the precipice. And now I'll just take a step back to say we in the States are very worried about an opioid epidemic. There's a lot of drug use and abuse in the States, especially in urban areas and in rural areas. And so I feel like this is what Gyasi is working out too. She's asking questions about why the uptick in drug abuse. And again, she's making clear that it is not about personal weakness simply or bad decisions, that this is a 200-year-old effect of a 200-year-old legacy. I want to make sure we have time to talk about some of these things. So when Sunny asks the man who sweeps the barber shops on 7th Avenue, and he says he takes drugs to stand it, he is now offering Sunny a release. But it is not Sunny who takes center stage in this chapter, but a young woman named Amani, who will ultimately be a significant part of Sunny's future. She is the one to put her drink on the piano and to sing in harmony, as indicated by her name, Amani, harmony in Swahili. Her drink on the piano in Gyasi echoes back to the last line in James Baldwin's story, where the drink on the piano shook like the very cup of trembling, a biblical reference from Baldwin's childhood. Amani and Sunny discuss the Back to Africa movement, and Amani, appearing to be the voice of Gyasi's conscience, says, here's our quote, "This is what brings everything full circle back to Africa where the novel started. We can't go back to something that isn't ours anymore," she says. "This is." And when she says that quote, she sweeps her hand in front of her as though she were trying to catch all of Harlem in it, all of New York, all of America. She is part of the American story, just as Sunny and his mother, Willie, just as James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois. With that gesture, Gyasi too is telling us this is an American story, born out of Africa, that we hold in our hands. It is like the 1960s movement, a story about progress, but also a story about broken promises. The reversal in this chapter lies in the fact that it gives us a backstory to Sunny in a way that Baldwin's story does not. Sunny may flush the drugs from the barbershop sweeper earlier in the section, leading us to think this may not be Sunny's blues after all. But the harmonizing Amani becomes the figure to lead Sunny to heroin. And although we are not told how Baldwin's Sunny gets hooked on drugs, we have a strong feeling that it comes from a sense of helplessness of growing up in Harlem and the projects. When he walks into the drug house in Harlem with Amani, we learn what gives her glazed over look in her eyes. When she offers him this time, he does not refuse. The asterisk following that paragraph where he's offered the drugs, that asterisk following the paragraph is jarring. It tells us readers that we will be thrown out of the present time, and when we emerge on the other side of that little star, we will not know what happened in the time since. On the other side of the asterisk, the narrator tells us of Sonny. And here's a quote. He was a 45-year-old dope fiend, and he was tired, but he was also sick. And the sickness of trying to come off the dope outweighed his exhaustion with staying on it every single time. Like Baldwin's Sonny, Gyasi's Sonny now seems trapped in a cycle of sickness, addiction, and poverty. The setting itself emerges as a character, once inextricable from heroin use itself. Harlem and heroin, heroin and Harlem. Sonny could no longer think of one without thinking of the other. They sounded alike. Both were going to kill him. The junkies and the jazz had gone together, fed each other, and now every time Sonny heard a horn, he wanted a hit. In the end, Sonny's mother worries about him ending up dead or worse. Sonny wonders, quote, what could be worse than dead? All around him, the evidence was clear. Only weeks before, the NYPD had shot down a 15-year-old black boy, a student, for next to nothing. The shooting started riots, pitting young black men and some black women against the police force. The news made it sound like the fault lay with the blacks of Harlem. Once again, this passage goes back to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man from 1952, which takes up these same issues. White men get a choice, Sonny's mother tell him. They also choose for black men by selling them into slavery and later sending them to prison so they can't be with their children. Another reference to Baldwin's work, If Beale Street Could Talk. We get in Jesse's version, Homegoing, the mother's voice, and we get Amani's voice. We get Baldwin's voice intertwined with Jesse's. We have a sense of the past and the present, and also, uncannily, we see a sense of the future, our present time in the 21st century. All right, this is my last paragraph, and then I promise we'll talk. It is not until the Marcus chapter of Homegoing, the chapter named after Sonny's son, that we learn that Sonny has survived addiction with the help of a methadone clinic. It is Sonny who, in turn, educates his son Marcus. Sonny would tell Marcus, here's a quote, about how America used to lock up black men off the sidewalks for labor, or how redlining kept banks from investing in black neighborhoods, preventing mortgages or business loans. Was it a wonder that prisons were still full of them? Is it a wonder that the ghetto was the ghetto? Sonny knows firsthand what he has protected his son from. Marcus, in the final section of the novel, is pursuing his PhD in sociology at Stanford. The novel ends with Marcus and Marjorie in the water and back in Africa, swimming near the Cape Coast Castle. Marjorie is a descendant of Akua, whom we talked about earlier, right? She is a descendant of the African line, and Marcus is a descendant of the American line, his great-great-great-grandmother who was sold into slavery. And they come together as if to say these stories join us, and they are so interrelated. And they all go back to Cape Coast Castle. And Jesse will say, why do we not know the history of Cape Coast Castle? The novel ends with Marcus and Marjorie in the water and back in Africa, swimming near the castle. In the end, in other words, it is the beginning of the novel, but also the beginning of a new future for Marjorie and Marcus, descendants of a long line of Africans tracing all the way back to before the slave trade. Welcome home, Marjorie says to Marcus. He was born and raised in Harlem. He is swimming off the coast in Ghana. Welcome home, she tells him. And in this sense, she also seems to refer to previous condition, James Baldwin. Marjorie's references to this previous condition, unlike Baldwin's, is restorative. It offers a new hope, a way of moving forward after learning about the past, of bearing witness, in the same way that Gyasi has asked us all to do by opening this novel and finding our way through. So following on that, we have 10 or 15 minutes. My questions for you, but you've been here for a couple of days. We can also take up your questions. How can knowing a literary tradition be a powerful tool against colonial rule and its effects? I think a lot of times we think about fighting back in terms of militaries, weapons, bombs. What the literary tradition tells us is that we have words, we have a tradition, we have art. I don't know if that's just me, a literature professor talking, saying we can fight back with novels. So I'm wondering if you think that's naive. How might Gyasi's novel help us to see that contemporary problems date back to colonialism and the slave trade? How are the problems in 2025 linked not to bad decisions, but to 200 years, decisions made, actions made, colonization 200 years ago? How has storytelling contributed to colonial power? The reverse works the same way, right? The missionaries, the colonists, they all have the power to tell a story. Whose story gets listened to? And what is the effect of the lost story of, Cape Cod? Oh, that's Cape Coast Castle. We are not talking about a vacation property in Massachusetts, right? Cape Coast Castle. What is the effect of that lost story? So should we go to a passage first, closely read it, and then maybe think about a question or two? Do you want to talk about the Ghana side or the Harlem side? Do you have a preference? I can find a passage related to one of those. Which one? The Harlem. Okay. So that gives us... a lot of these have references to drugs, right? I'm interested in what you think about that. The 45-year-old dope fiend. Let's look at this one. I think this is the most poetic. We know, like, the Harlem Renaissance is like the 1920s, the birth of African and African-American art. Jazz is a huge part of this scene in Harlem. I think it's so interesting that many of these important writers think about the legacy of jazz. And Gyasi turns that over a little bit, right? She makes jazz inextricable from drugs. Harlem and heroin, heroin and Harlem. Both were going to kill him. The junkies and jazz had gone together. I just spent an hour saying art will save us. And Gyasi is saying the jazz will kill him as much as the drugs. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Or just generally what she says about life in Harlem. Yeah, thank you. Hi.
Thank you, ma'am. I think what he's thinking is that jazz has also a very specific context in which it emerged. It has its relationship with the African American people and their history, and many of the lyrics of jazz also convey that. So for him it is like there is no escape either from heroin or from Harlem. Both remind him of the same trap in which he finds himself.
Great point. Yeah, Yeah, I mean, jazz is a musical kind of legacy of suffering, right? Of communicating a traumatic history. And while we can see like the reparative effects of a musical tradition, it also carries with it this this traumatic history. And so that part weighs on him, as well as the living in Harlem, as well as like feeling like he is under the influence of a drug addiction. Yes.
I would like to point out the later part of the paragraph. The junkies and the jazz had gone together, fed each other, and now every time Sonny heard a horn, he wanted a hit. From a psychological point of view, I would say that is conditioning. Every time he had a hit, subconsciously he might have heard a horn in the background. So now every time he consciously hears a horn, there's another want, another impulse of indulging into drugs.
That's
So
so smart. That goes back to, I know I assigned you Bessel van der Kolk, and I kind of left him by the side because I'm less interested in bodies and more in literature. But this ties the body in, right? There is this kind of brain impulse. Now he has been trained, like his brain has been wired to associate the sound of the horn, the sound of jazz, what he thought would be the saving grace, is now connected with associations with drugs. And it kind of leads him to go to another hit. So it's like this trap, right? Like the things that he thought would make him free, the sound of jazz, the being high on drugs, now they have both trapped him, and one entrapment reinforces the other.
Hello, ma'am.
Yes, hi.
The Harlem and heroin, as we see the history of Afro-American. So the Africans came America as a slave, and now and they fought for the equality, and so they were the they were not the part of mainstream literature. So they started enjoying self, and for that, and that sake they took the help of the heroine to enjoy, and through these some of the new words and some of the new things came, that language are yo, bro, like, and we see the jazz culture in Alice Walker's The Color Purple,
Yes.
and so and that novel, it shows that and that's okay how the Afro Americans they fight for the equality and all. So that's all from my side, ma'am.
Thank you so much. That's a lot from your side. Yes, so you said a couple of things. Remember, we saw that quote about the colonizer in a Chebe's text who's saying, I'm going to write the story of Africans. He talks about civilizing the primitive, right? And the same thing is happening with regard to U.S. history. History books are saying that slaves were happy, they were well clothed, they were fed, they were given, a place to sleep. And so the jazz tradition, in that way, is writing against the master narrative about how useful or helpful slavery was to Africans. We know that that is not true, right? So Gyasi is saying the same thing. She's kind of thinking about the importance of writing back to that, not only in music, but in jazz. And it's not only Gyasi doing that. Think about all of these authors who are writing back to that master narrative through a musical art form that is rooted in African aesthetics, right, and tradition. So Alice Walker uses jazz, Ralph Ellison uses jazz, James Baldwin uses jazz, Gyasi uses jazz. So this can be a useful thing to think about too. And again, back to our first comment, jazz is an art form kind of rooted in a history of trauma and violence, but it also is a kind of celebration of resiliency in life. And isn't maybe that the narrative we want to hold on to rather than the colonizers, pacification of the African. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so if we kind of want to think about the subjective experience of the African person or African American person, maybe we look to African American literature or jazz and not to like the textbooks written right by the colonizer. Thank you. Yes.
So I wanted to talk about not about drugs or Harlem, but I want to talk about the importance of literary devices, the literary traditions that uh, even India has, even America has, even Europe has, that every single state, every single country has,
Yes.
every single language has.
Yes.
So uh, exactly like how Africans were colonized and they were uh, exploited and they were caught for slavery, we could understand their importance of literary devices, literary traditions, by also understanding India's literary traditions.
Yes.
Because uh, literature during the colonization period and after independence and even during the whole struggle of independence was played a huge role, because not only it helped aware people about the situation, but it also helped encourage them, motivate them. So, and even now uh, we can see that how much we struggled back in that time, what capacities we have, what capabilities we have, what we can do, what we can do against if somebody is exploiting us even now, because it's not like we have stopped experiencing any kind of exploitation, any kind of suffering, because we are still struggling in the whole global view.
Yes.
And the literature, the books, the texts that were that we see now not only helped during what do we say, freedom struggle, not only helped aware people, but it also helped transport arms. Like the Azad Hind Sena was, they used to cut the books insides and they used to store the weaponry in there. So the books, they first got the books, they used to read it, they used to make the whole plan of theirs, then they used to cut it, they used to put weapons in it, and then they used to give them to the other people who were in their Sena, their army that they had formed against the Britishers. So the literature not only literally helped us by words, but also the copies of them. That's what I remembered, that's what I wanted to tell.
That's an amazing story. Thank you for adding that. Absolutely. Benedict Anderson wrote this book called Imagined Communities, and it's really old now, I guess, maybe over 20 years, but that kind of changed my way of thinking about literature and a tradition. He said, like, we think about communities as people living together, but think about the literature of a community as building community. It comes from the imagination, from reading, right? Passing a book from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, and people building community based on that shared knowledge and experience of reading. And it also builds like a coalition, right? Like a sense of unity and power. That's from reading common texts. Like that's how you build community. So that's lovely. There's a microphone in the, yes.
Hello, ma'am. I wanted to focus on the first phrase, that is Harlem and heroine, the alliteration part. Harlem and heroine, Harlem and heroine, and heroine and Harlem. So this alliteration part actually emphasizes on how the environment and the drug experience, how the environment and the drug experience are quite internally linked and fused, making it almost impossible for Sunny to separate his environment from his drug addiction.
Yes. And
So-
you see, yeah, and what the narrator says is you see that in the structure of the words, which I think is so interesting, right? You read that quote, they sounded alike. That's not only alike by association, but in the way that they sound, in the way that they're spelled. Harlem starts with H, heroin starts with H. I guess Harlem, heroin is 3 syllables, so that's not like super on point, but yeah, like capital H, capital H. It's like they're parallel. And so Gyasi is asking us to think about that. And I love your response, which is not only are they kind of alike in the way that they sound and the way they look on the page, but they are inextricable now in the life of Sunny. You cannot have one without the other. And the question is, like, how do we break that, or why, right? I feel like, thank you. Like, this reading builds so much empathy, it seems to me, for Sunny, right? Like, we cannot throw away this kid and put him in prison. Like, he has like this immense way of thinking about how he has been impacted by his father's history and his father's history, and all of these are interrelated, like you said. So thank you.
This is more of a doubt and a question than like an explanation. An explanation to this. I can see that like there is a lot of mention of drug use and things in this novel, and I'm extremely grateful that you suggested this novel in the reading. My question is, whenever I try to theorize generational trauma, there are 2 questions that are being constantly asked. One is like when you talk about drug use or crime rates, the instant reaction to it is like to pathologize it and call the whole community mentally ill and further oppress them and use it as a tool for further oppression. And another thing, whenever I talk about generational trauma or try to write about it, is that when we talk about oppression 200 years back, here Gyasi's heroine, or like the protagonist, is a daughter of a professor. And whenever I talk about generational trauma, this is like, they say that how could oppression that was 200 years ago affect a daughter of a Harvard, like Stanford professor who is already so privileged? And like, doesn't trauma fade away with every generation, like as they accumulate wealth, or if they have land, or even holding a MacBook is like something that is considered extremely privileged thing. So how to theorize generational trauma, or how to anchor it in like the methodology of research? Can you please help me with that?
I can tell you what I think from what I've read, and then, yeah, I'd love to hear how you can develop this thought. So I'm really interested in Deanna Wardy's Memorial Candles, and she thinks about intergenerational trauma from the perspective of Holocaust survivors, like the fact that a child of a Holocaust survivor feels like they don't have the whole story, and yet they feel kind of burdened with the fate of the world and the fate of history. So they are like memorial themselves. And so the question is, kind of back to pathology, the pathology part, like how do you understand this transmission of history, and what does it mean to kind of think about it as like connected with badness, or ineffectiveness, or like madness, right? And so some people would say, like, to go back to the end of Gyasi's novel, we can think about that ending in one of 2 ways. We can kind of think about the ending as continuing on this tradition of frustration and struggle, because isn't that what it's trying to represent? But Gyasi doesn't do that. She puts 2 privileged people together back at Cape Coast Castle, and says, we are home. And some readers have said, I do not like that. It's too easy. Two privileged people meet together and they are home. Why this happy ending? And I feel like Gyasi would say, because she's sick and tired of this idea that there can never be a sense of the way out of the loop, right? How do you break this cycle? She puts two people, one side of the family that was traumatized by a murderous baptism, back in the water, off the shores where it all started, and they can start again, on their own terms. And so I can only answer from the perspective of literary tradition, which is a writer can decide, right? Am I going to de-pathologize this story finally? And then you're met with criticism, like, it's not that easy. You've just written 300 pages about, a traumatized 2 lines of the family. You can't just like tie it together with a perfect package. But Gyasi's like, I'm going to take a stand and I'm going to imagine a future for these characters. So, it's an aesthetic choice as much as a philosophical one or psychological one. So we've gone over 5 Oh, but we have a question. You're going to have the last word, and then I'll let you break.
Yeah, it's just pretty basic things to add on. I would like to think about Ekricha feminine here. Helen Sissu's The Laugh of Medusa, where which there was one tradition where men were writing, and only then we could. It doesn't go with it, isn't it? This passage, but the questions that about storytelling, and that comes to the end. So Ekricha feminine, where women's writing or feminine writing was mostly introduced, and women started writing about themselves. And same happens with when it comes to India, about Dalit writing, and also in African literatures, where we suppose there is one story, I guess it's in The Color Purple, or again The Things Fall Apart or something, where in the beginning this story that she actually read had a flower or something which was only about America, which was seen in America. So when she started writing, she gradually wrote with themes and colors which she couldn't even relate in her real life. It was only after a point of time that she realized that it is their tradition that we are following, because it's the it's in the common common or the literature that usually we get is the famous or the central world literature. So that is something, the story which is being told, who says the story, is very important, and that gives us a perception or gives us a clarity about what is being said. It's not just you read and it's just what is there. So I would like to add on that.
That's really great. Yeah, I mean, Laugh of Medusa. Yeah, you could probably tell, like, my point of reference is these Greek goddesses, like Medea and Jasmine Ward's Salvage the Bones. And my question to Professor Singh after the presentation was about the significance of Cassandra. When I read Without Inspection and thought about the falling person, I was thinking about Icarus, right, and Daedalus. And then Danticott comes through and says, no, my point of reference was the Sons of Solomon, right? The flying Africans. Like, that's the myth I'm interested in. So, like, even the tools we might read for reading, like thinking about Greek mythology as a way to guide our sense of what is being told in a contemporary text, that's even kind of a colonial force, right? Like, every culture has their own myths that resonate. And wouldn't it be awesome if we can kind of think about a sense of a literary tradition through the myths of cultures in which we've been immersed or raised, right? Greek mythology, like Medusa is not the only goddess that we can kind of think about, use to think about and make sense of things, nor is Medea, right? So that's really useful. I think that should be our last word. So I'm going to turn the mic off. Thank you for your suggestions and feedbacks. And I just have one announcement. I turn, which is, I think we only have about half or 3/5 of the Guyan course feedbacks. So if you have a form, could you please fill it out? I think we want it by today or today, ideally. If you don't have a feedback form, let us know. What is next? A coffee break, tea break, and then we'll come back here for a tutorial at 12. Okay, so you have some time. Thank you, everybody.